Big Shaq bought the house, bought the furniture, still got accused of stealing it. One call from a racist woman, and cops were at his door. But what happens next? Willow Creek wasn't ready. Because Big Shaq didn't just own the keys, he flipped the whole damn script. And what followed, nobody saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun poured across the rooftops of Willow Creek like warm syrup, coating everything in gold. The streets were still, trimmed hedges bowing gently in the breeze. The occasional bark from a distant dog the only sign of life. A place that looked like a postcard, wrapped in perfection, but lined with something older. Something quieter. Something buried. Shaquille O'Neal, known to millions as Big Shaq, the giant with a heart even bigger, stepped out onto the stone front steps of his newly purchased colonial mansion. He wore a simple hoodie and basketball shorts. No security, no assistance, just a man taking in the morning. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the sunlight settle on his face. It was peaceful, almost.
The house was over 100 years old, towering with white columns and ivy-covered brick. It had belonged to an oil baron once, then a judge, then a CEO who left in silence during a corporate scandal. Now it belonged to Shaq, who had chosen it not for luxury but for its soul. He liked things with history. He believed broken things could still breathe life. Inside, boxes were half unpacked, the sound of moving crews still echoing faintly from the rear wing. Shaq had refused the idea of hiring a designer. He wanted his fingerprints on every piece. The walls would hold memories, not just paintings. The rooms would speak, not in curated tones, but in truths. But as he stood on that porch, something in the air shifted. Not loud, not sudden, but definite. It wasn't a breeze or a chill. It was a glance, a presence, across the street. The woman was barely visible behind the lace curtains of a white-painted craftsman house directly opposite. Elegant, motionless, and poised like she belonged on a coin. Her name wasn't known to him yet, but her energy was sharp, watching, judging, weighing something unspoken. She didn't smile, just stared, then vanished into the shadows of her living room. Shaq shrugged it off, walked back inside, and resumed organizing. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar and wax. He carefully unwrapped a framed photo of his mother, Lucille, her eyes full of warmth and warning. He placed it above the fireplace in the den. Next came a wooden sculpture carved by a kid from a low-income art program he'd funded in Detroit. He remembered the boy's name. He remembered them all. By midday, the delivery truck pulled into the driveway. Two men hopped out, wheeling in crates stamped with Shaq's initials. Handcrafted furniture, a mix of industrial steel and reclaimed wood. The kind of furniture that tells stories, with scars and burns, and beauty. The crew worked steadily, carefully. No one was loud, no one careless. The men laughed about old sports clips, one quietly muttering how surreal it was to deliver to Big Shaq himself. But Shaq stayed in the background. He always preferred watching people over performing for them. His days of entertaining crowds were done. Still, it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of unease. More curtains shifted across the street. Windows opened, then closed. Cars slowed as they passed the house. He could feel the pulse of the neighborhood changing, like the tide pulling back before a wave. There were no greetings, no cookies from neighbors, no welcome baskets. Only the distance polite, practiced, and unmistakably cold. By late afternoon, the moving truck had rolled away. The house was quiet again. Shaq stood in the center of the grand foyer, now dressed with the bones of his past. Signed jerseys, family heirlooms, the smell of pine and home. Then came the knock. Not loud, not desperate, but authoritative. He opened the door to find two officers standing at the threshold. One older, hard-jawed with a clipped mustache. The other younger, eyes darting, uncertain. Their cruiser was parked just behind the mailbox. Lights off. Doors open. The older officer spoke first. His voice was professional, but not friendly. "Got a call about a possible theft in progress," he said. Shaq blinked. "You're at the right address," he replied calmly. The younger officer shifted. His eyes scanned the entryway, noting the marble floors, the high ceilings, the grand chandelier. Still, his expression didn't change. "We received a report that someone was removing furniture from the premises," the older one continued. "Mind showing ID?" Shaq exhaled slowly, reached into his pocket, and handed over his license.
They read it, looked at him, then back at the license. The silence stretched. The officers didn't say much after that. No apology, no clarification, just a mumbled thanks before turning to leave. One of them paused and looked back, then nodded faintly. As they drove off, Shaq stood frozen in the doorway. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But something inside him stirred. A knot. An ache. He turned back into the house and shut the door. The sound echoed louder than expected, like a gavel falling. Outside, the golden glow of morning had faded. The light was still there, but something else lingered now. A subtle tension, like the hum before a storm. Willow Creek had just met Big Shaq, and something told him this town wasn't ready. Eleanor Whitmore didn't miss much. She never had. From her bay window, perched neatly behind lace curtains and flower-trimmed shutters, she monitored Willow Creek like it was her private kingdom. A porcelain teacup sat idle in her hand, the Earl Grey long gone cold. Her eyes, however, were sharp as ever. She'd lived in that house for 42 years, buried a husband, hosted fundraisers, chaired the garden club. She could recall every tree planted, every family that came and went, and what kind of people they were. According to her, people fell into types: the respectable, the disruptive, and the ones who didn't belong. And from the moment the deed changed hands across the street, she placed Shaquille O'Neal in the last category. She recognized him immediately. Of course. Everyone did. He'd once been on the cover of the magazines her husband read. But fame didn't impress Eleanor. Fame, in her view, was often a mask worn by trouble. And while the neighborhood had seen celebrities pass through before, musicians, tech moguls, even a senator's mistress, none of them looked like him. None of them moved in like they planned to stay. At first she kept quiet. A raised brow here, a polite smile there. But as the trucks arrived and the furniture began to pour in, handcrafted pieces too refined to be mistaken for cheap replicas, the discomfort in her chest sharpened. It wasn't the money that bothered her. It was the change, the undoing of what she thought this place stood for. Her fingers hovered over the keypad on the antique rotary phone she insisted on keeping in the front hall. Her cell phone, which she barely used, buzzed with a message from her neighbor 2 doors down. Is it really him? Is that his house now? She didn't reply. She didn't need confirmation. She needed order. From her window, she saw 2 men wheeling in a steel and wood bookshelf, followed by what looked like an African-carved headboard. One of the movers, light-skinned and heavily tattooed, chuckled and high-fived Shaq. He was standing near the porch with a clipboard, his smile warm, but his presence large, and to Eleanor, unmissably disruptive. She sipped her tea again, only to find it cold, her fingers tensed around the porcelain. In her world, things had a place, a rhythm, and Shaq didn't match the rhythm of Willow Creek. He walked like he owned more than just his home. He walked like the street should shift for him, the kind of walk that told a story no one had asked to hear. Not in her view. The phone call was short. There's a large man moving expensive furniture into the house at 408 Edgeview Lane, she said crisply. I don't believe he owns the property. Could be a break-in. The dispatcher asked for her name. She hesitated. Just a concerned neighbor, she answered, her voice perfectly practiced. I think you should send someone. Then she returned to her window, where her stare resumed, colder now, tighter. A flicker of satisfaction passed through her as the squad car rolled down the hill, turning onto Shaq's driveway without hesitation. She didn't smile, but her breath settled. It was subtle, the way she turned from the window, like a curtain closing on a scene she believed she'd managed. But in her mind, it wasn't malice. It was duty. She'd always been the kind to keep things in check. Weeds in the garden, strangers in the neighborhood. But what Eleanor didn't see, what she couldn't grasp, was the way the world was no longer obeying her rules. That the street she'd kept tidy for decades was changing in a way that couldn't be clipped back or straightened out. She didn't see the woman walking her dog pause to watch the police car with concern. She didn't notice the paper boy, usually carefree, hesitate at the corner. She didn't feel the tension she'd sparked winding through the neighborhood like smoke. Inside her grand parlor, Eleanor resumed her seat and turned on the local news. A segment about rising housing prices in diverse communities played on low volume. She barely heard it. Her mind was fixed on the porch across the street, now empty again. The squad car was gone, but something lingered in the air. A thread had been pulled. Later that evening she told herself she'd done the right thing, that if she'd been wrong, no harm was done, and if she'd been right, she had helped protect the neighborhood. But beneath her rationalizing, a restless current stirred, the fear of being wrong in a way that couldn't be undone. Across the street, the porch light flicked on. Shaq was seated quietly, elbows on knees, looking out at the same street she was, not watching her, just watching. They didn't see each other that night, not clearly, but they felt each other's presence like gravity. Two forces orbiting, colliding in silence. The kind of silence that promises a storm. And Eleanor, for all her certainty, couldn't shake the feeling that she'd started something she no longer controlled. The sound came sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade against silk. Two squad cars rolled down Edgeview Lane, their sirens quieted now, lights pulsing in red and blue strobe. It was a strange sight in Willow Creek, a neighborhood that prided itself on polished lawns and private security. Police presence was rare, and when it did occur, it was usually for noise complaints or misplaced packages. But this was different. Curtains fluttered, blinds tilted. Porches became stages for silent spectators. People didn't step outside, not fully, but they leaned just far enough to catch the show. Two officers exited their vehicles with that purposeful stride, not quite urgent, but certainly not casual. They scanned the property as if it were foreign soil. Shaq stood on the stone path that led to his front door, hands in plain sight, posture unthreatening. He was wearing a black hoodie and house slippers, a bottle of water in one hand. His expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes tightened. Not fear, not confusion. Just a quiet disbelief. He had seen this dance before. The uniforms changed. The tone remained the same. The lead officer, badge number glinting beneath the name Brad Kinley, stepped forward, square jaw, buzz cut, mid-40s, the type molded from protocols and ego. His partner, Officer Drew Kessler, younger, kept his distance, scribbling something into a notepad he barely looked at. Kinley spoke first. "Sir, we received a report of a possible theft in progress. Neighbors say they saw furniture being removed." Shaq didn't blink. "That's my furniture. This is my home." Kinley's eyes flicked up the facade of the mansion, then down to the keys still dangling from Shaq's belt loop. "Do you have proof of ownership?" Shaq reached slowly into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a document sleeve. He handed it over without a word. Inside was the deed, notarized, complete with the ink barely dry from closing. Kinley took it, examined the name, then glanced back at Shaq. He knew the name. Everyone did. But the hesitation lingered, not because of uncertainty, but because acknowledgement required humility, and Kinley didn't wear humility well. "You just moved in?" Kinley asked, tone flat. "Today," Shaq replied. "The delivery truck just left. You probably passed it." Kessler looked up now, glancing at the stack of boxes just inside the open doorway. Modern furniture, clearly new, custom pieces, nothing looked stolen. But Kinley kept his face unreadable. "Mind if we look around?" he asked, not quite a request. Shaq gestured toward the foyer. "Help yourself." The officers stepped inside, shoes echoing across polished hardwood. They didn't touch anything, but their eyes moved like scanners. The house didn't just reflect wealth. It reflected story. There were photos of Shaq with kids from scholarship programs, newspaper clippings about free clinics he'd sponsored, a wall of thank you notes from single mothers, teachers, struggling veterans. It was hard to miss the message. Kessler's gaze softened. He lingered at a framed letter from a third-grade class. Kinley, meanwhile, seemed unmoved. He scanned, lingered, turned, and said, "You keep a big place like this all to yourself." Shaq met his eyes. "That a crime now?" Kinley didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back outside, eyes scanning the growing number of neighbors watching from porches and windows. The narrative was changing. The caller, whoever they were, had brought the law into a moment that never needed policing. Kessler handed back the documents. "Everything checks out," he said quietly. Shaq nodded once. The silence stretched again. Then, as if releasing a breath they'd been holding together, the officers turned back toward their cars. But before they left, Kinley paused, just at the edge of the walkway. He turned and said, "Not everyone around here's going to be thrilled, Mr. O'Neill. You'll probably want to keep an eye on who's watching." Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words lingered like smoke, heavy with implication, and not entirely hidden. The cruisers pulled away, lights dimmed now, engines humming low. As they disappeared over the hill, the quiet returned, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was tainted, weighted. Shaq stood for a long moment before stepping back inside and closing the door. He walked to the living room, sank into the large leather chair by the window, and stared out across the street. Eleanor's curtains had shifted again. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but deep inside, something cracked. Not a break. A shift. Like a stone finally grinding against another, carving the start of something deeper. He pulled out his phone, opened a notepad app, and began typing. Not a post, not a press release, just a thought. The most dangerous weapon in the suburbs isn't a gun, it's suspicion dressed as concern. He set the phone down. The sun had begun to fall behind the trees, casting long shadows across the street. The golden glow of earlier was gone, replaced by something colder. But Shaq didn't move. He watched, waited. Somewhere inside the house, the central air kicked on, a low hum filling the space. Outside, a new kind of silence took over Willow Creek. Not peaceful this time, but hesitant. A neighborhood had witnessed something it didn't quite know how to process, and Big Shaq, sitting steady in his chair, had just become something more than a resident. He had become a question, and the town didn't yet know how to answer. The sun dipped low behind the rooftops of Willow Creek, casting a dull amber over the wide streets. Inside the mansion, shadows stretched across the floor like memories returning. Shaq sat alone in the den. The lights dim, the silence dense. The house was filled with the presence of furniture, framed memories, and curated warmth. But in that moment it felt hollow. A container holding something heavier than comfort. He leaned back in the leather chair and closed his eyes. The events of the day replayed, not with volume, but with weight. The squad cars, the cold eyes, the words spoken just beneath their meaning. His breath was steady, but somewhere inside, something stirred, a familiar ache wrapped in memory. His mind wandered, and with it, the room faded. He was 13 again. A boy too tall for his age, living in Newark, New Jersey. Nights were long and restless. The city was never quiet. Sirens, arguments, distant horns. He remembered sitting on the steps of their modest apartment building, bouncing a ball in rhythm with the chaos. The thud of the rubber on cracked pavement was his lullaby, a beat that drowned out the noise around him. Back then, his world was made of two things: noise and his mother, Lucille. She was the kind of woman who didn't raise her voice unless prayer was involved. She moved through struggle with a spine made of something holy. Lucille didn't preach. She demonstrated. When the landlord gave her looks that said she'd never make rent, she handed him an envelope before he could ask. When the grocer muttered something about people like you, she smiled, picked the freshest produce and told Shaq, "Let them choke on their hate, baby. You eat good, you grow strong." Lucille taught him strength, but never with fists. Her strength was in dignity. It was in walking into rooms that weren't made for her, and owning her space without apology. And she passed that to him not in words, but in how she survived. He remembered one particular night. A white neighbor had called the cops on Shaq for playing ball too loud in the alley. The officers showed up, rough, dismissive. He was 14, 6'3", already a shadow of the man he'd become. They made him sit on the curb while they sorted it out. They asked whose kid he was. He said Lucille's. They didn't believe him until she marched out barefoot in a bathrobe, eyes on fire. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She stood between them and her son and said, "He's mine, and he's not going to be less than anyone. Not now, not ever." The officers left. But the feeling stayed. Shaq never forgot the chill in his bones that night. The realization that no matter how big he got, how many points he scored, how much money he made, someone could still see him as less than a man. Years later, when he entered the NBA, fame hit like a tidal wave. Cameras, endorsements, private jets. But behind every bright moment was that quiet shadow. The knowledge that to some he would always be a threat in the wrong zip code. He tried to outrun it. Through success, through generosity, through silence. But it always returned. And now, sitting in the home he owned, in a town that didn't want to see him, that shadow felt close again. He opened his eyes. The room returned. On the far wall hung a photo of him and Lucille at his Jersey retirement ceremony. Her smile was proud, fierce. He stared at it for a long time, until the lines around his eyes softened. Then came another memory, not of pain, but purpose. It was his rookie year. He had just signed a major deal and bought Lucille her dream house. On the day she moved in, She walked the halls, running her fingers along the walls. Then she turned to him and said, "Don't just fill it with things. Fill it with people who need shelter. Make sure it don't just shine. Make sure it matters." That stuck with him. Over the years he'd done just that. Paid off mortgages for strangers, built homes for hurricane victims, donated school buses, rebuilt basketball courts. Not for applause, but because he remembered what it felt like to be unseen. But kindness didn't immunize him, and Willow Creek was proof of that. Outside, porch lights blinked on one by one. The neighborhood was alive, but eerily quiet, like everyone was pretending nothing had happened. As if the squad cars hadn't been here. As if the suspicion hadn't been loud and clear. He rose from the chair and walked toward the front window. Across the street, Eleanor Whitmore's curtains were drawn again, but he could feel her gaze, whether it was there or not. That kind of judgment didn't need line of sight. It lived in air, in stone, in legacy. Shaq leaned on the window frame, his silhouette bathed in soft light. He didn't feel rage. Rage burned quick. What he felt was deeper, like heat in the soil, waiting to grow into something lasting. He knew now what this move really was. It wasn't just a new chapter. It was a confrontation with everything the world still hadn't unlearned. And if Willow Creek wasn't ready for him, then maybe it needed him more than it realized. By morning, Willow Creek was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a trending hashtag. A neighbor, no one quite knew who, had filmed the police cruiser pulling into Shaq's driveway the day before. The video showed two officers questioning a calm, composed Shaquille O'Neal, standing outside his grand white-columned mansion in house slippers. There was no audio, just 25 seconds of tension wrapped in silence. It was uploaded with a caption that ignited everything. Shaquille O'Neal accused of stealing from his own house. The footage spread like dry grass catching fire. One retweet turned into thousands. Major outlets picked it up. Headlines followed. Suspicion in suburbia. Shaq questioned at new home. An NBA legend profiled in upper-class neighborhood. Fame isn't armor. Racism doesn't retire. And just like that, what started as a whispered accusation from behind a lace curtain became a national debate. The local news was the first on the scene. A single van, with a satellite dish parked across from Shaq's home. Camera crews spilling out. Then came the bigger trucks. CNN, MSNBC, even a rep from TMC leaning over a metal fence with a handheld mic, hoping for a glimpse. Shaq didn't come outside. He watched it all from the upstairs study, the one with bay windows overlooking the street. He said nothing. No tweets, no statements, just observation. His silence wasn't retreat. It was measured.
Eleanor Whitmore, on the other hand, was quick to speak.
By noon, a local reporter caught her on camera during her daily walk, dressed in pressed khakis and a pale lavender cardigan. Her dog, Winston, tugged against the leash while she offered a statement that tried to soften what she'd done. "I just didn't recognize him," she said. There were men moving furniture into the house, and in that moment, I panicked. That's all it was. It was a rehearsed kind of contrition, not quite remorse, more like damage control. But the internet didn't forget. Old footage surfaced. A 2016 clip from a garden party fundraiser. The same Eleanor, holding a champagne flute, laughing with a group of women. "Oh, please," she said, voice cheerful. "I've watched every Lakers playoff game Shaq ever played. I used to scream at my TV like I was courtside." The contradiction was a wrecking ball. Comment sections filled with outrage. Articles cited statistics on racial profiling, class privilege and gated communities. Civil rights advocates weighed in. Even former teammates of Shaq's posted support. One wrote, "If Shaq ain't safe in his own home, what does that say about the rest of us?" Still, Shaq remained off the grid. No press conference, no rebuttal, no Instagram videos from his kitchen explaining his side. The silence was louder than any speech. Inside the mansion, he moved differently now. He took long walks down the back corridor, pacing past unpacked boxes. He read letters from charities he'd funded. He reread Lucille's last handwritten note, the one she'd left in her Bible before she passed. "Don't answer hate with noise. Answer it with your purpose." And so, while the cameras clustered at the edge of his property, Shaq began to plan. He started mapping names on a wall. Not enemies but allies. People he'd helped. People who owed nothing but might show up anyway. Youth centers, teachers, families who'd found housing because of him. Every one of them was a thread. In the basement, the gym he was building remained half-finished. He walked past the echoing concrete and thought, they expect me to retreat. Maybe it's time to invite the world in instead. Outside, Eleanor stayed mostly inside her home. Her front steps were bare, no morning walks now, no garden pruning. Her quiet street had become a gallery, and she was no longer curator. She was exhibit. Behind closed doors, her phone rang endlessly. Friends from book club, her sister from Atlanta, even the HOA president, Mr. Kendricks, who left a voicemail that was more worry than sympathy. We're getting calls, Eleanor. A lot of calls. Maybe it's time to stay out of sight. But Eleanor had never been the kind to vanish. She sat in her reading room, sunlight on her cheek, reading articles about herself in third person. The glare of her own contradictions stared back at her, and for the first time in years, she couldn't rationalize her way out. She said she didn't recognize him, but she had. She always had. And somewhere, deep inside, she knew the truth wasn't in what she claimed. It was in what she feared. Back across the street, night began to fall. Shaq pulled the curtains shut upstairs. Not to hide, but to focus. The media had awoken. The nation had its story. But Shaq, he had something deeper. A plan to turn the lens back on the people who thought they could define him. Not through speeches, not through rage, but through purpose, legacy, and something they didn't expect. Presence. By the third day, the buzz had gone from viral to volcanic. Cable panels debated the incident. Every hour. Morning shows crafted segments titled, Privilege on the Porch, and Fame versus Fear in Suburbia. Civil rights attorneys offered commentary. Talk radio lit up with callers both furious and dismissive. Everyone had an opinion, except the man at the center of it all. Shaq hadn't said a word. Inside his mansion, behind the glass walls and closed gates, a quiet war of opinions brewed. His team had gathered, publicist, legal advisor, PR strategist, even his longtime manager, Daryl Monroe, who flew in from LA, without being asked. They sat in the study, surrounded by moving boxes and exposed brick, tossing around legal options like darts at a board. This could be defamation, Daryl argued, pacing. Or profiling. At the very least, an invasion of privacy. We've got a dozen civil rights lawyers who'd line up for this, another added. You've got the country watching. You could set a precedent. Shaq sat in a weathered armchair, arms folded, expression unreadable. The windows behind him framed Eleanor's house across the street, curtains still drawn like the aftermath of a storm. He listened. Then slowly he shook his head. This ain't about lawsuits, he said finally. This is about sickness. The kind that sits quiet in people's hearts. You don't cure that in court. The room went silent. They knew that tone. That stillness that meant the decision was made. Daryl sighed, rubbed his jaw. So what do you want to do, man? Just wait this out? Let her win the narrative? Shaq didn't answer. At least, not directly. He rose from the chair, walked to the fireplace mantel, and picked up a photo. A girl, maybe 9 years old, holding a new backpack in front of a rundown school, smiling like she'd just been handed the world. He remembered her name. Zariah. He'd donated supplies to her school after a flood nearly shut it down. She'd hugged him so tight he couldn't breathe. This ain't her fight, he said mostly to himself. But she's watching. That night, Eleanor Whitmore made her next move. While the news focused on Shaq's silence, she quietly coordinated with several longtime Willow Creek residents. People she'd served tea to for decades, neighbors who trusted her judgment. They arranged an emergency town hall under the pretense of preserving the character of the neighborhood. The flyer said nothing inflammatory. It was wrapped in language about property values and community harmony. But the undertones rang clear. Shaq caught wind of it from the grocery store clerk, a teenager who hesitated before sliding the flyer across the counter. It was on the corkboard, she said, her eyes low. The headline read, Concerned Residents Meeting, discussing recent disruptions in Willow Creek. He scanned the list of sponsors. Several names matched the mailbox signs he passed every morning on his jog. It wasn't just Eleanor now. It was a movement. That night, under low lighting in the living room, Shaq sat alone, rereading the flyer. He didn't feel surprised. He felt challenged. This was no longer about misunderstanding or microaggression. This was coordinated, measured, masked in the civility of HOA, minutes and community jargon. It was the kind of racism that hid behind smiles and bylaws. He didn't sleep much. By morning, his decision was made. The next day, without calling a press conference or alerting the media, He drafted a message. Not on social media. Not through publicists. He printed it, folded it, and hand-delivered it. Every doorstep on Edgeview Lane received the same envelope. Clean, white, no branding. Inside a letter, handwritten, signed, "Dear neighbor, you don't know me yet, but I know what you've heard, what you've seen, and what some of you might believe. So I'm inviting you in. Literally. This Sunday, the doors of 408 Edgeview Lane will be open. No RSVP, no cameras, just neighbors, in one room, sharing time, space, and hopefully a little truth. Come hungry. There will be food, music, and maybe a story or two. No speeches, no politics, just people." Shaquille O'Neal. By the time Eleanor found her copy, delivered discreetly, tucked under the seasonal wreath on her front door, it was too late. The neighborhood group chat had exploded. Some scoffed. Others were curious. A few admitted to being ashamed. Eleanor read it 3 times. She folded it slowly, slid it into a drawer beneath the hallway mirror, and said nothing. But she felt it. A shift. Not in tone, but in power. Shaq wasn't responding with force. He was responding with something harder to deflect. Presence. Grace. An invitation to confront themselves. And in a town that prided itself on decorum, it was the boldest move he could have made. The tipping point had come. But instead of falling, Shaq had built a table. And now the question wasn't whether people would show up. It was whether they were ready for what they'd see when they did. Sunday morning came dressed in a stillness Willow Creek hadn't felt in years. There were no sirens, no trucks, just sunlight washing over quiet streets, and neighbors who for once weren't pretending to be invisible behind curtains. Instead, they stepped onto porches holding the crisp white letter that had arrived days before. Shaq's invitation. Some wore curiosity. Others carried discomfort like a coat they couldn't quite shrug off. But by noon, feet began to cross the threshold of 408 Edgeview Lane. Not with confidence, but with cautious curiosity. Shaq stood just inside the foyer, greeting each guest with a nod and a firm handshake. He didn't smile too wide, didn't speak too long. His presence was enough. The same presence that once filled arenas, now filled his own home. A banner hung across the entry wall. Unity over fear. Below it, a simple quote from his mother, handwritten in white paint on reclaimed wood. "You can't hate up close. Get close enough to see the truth." The front room had been transformed. The designer furniture once mistaken as stolen was pushed to the sides, replaced by a different kind of decor, memory. Framed photos lined the walls, each with a story: a young boy from Louisiana grinning with 2 front teeth missing, holding a backpack nearly the size of his body. A mother and daughter hugging in front of a car Shaq had anonymously paid off, kids on new bikes, police officers at youth basketball clinics, teachers receiving classroom supplies in places no one ever filmed. A long table stretched across the dining room, covered in laminated notes, letters from children, scribbled in crayons and ballpoint pens. "Thank you for my shoes, Mr. Shaq. You made my dad smile again. I want to grow up big and help people too." In one corner, a flat-screen TV played a silent loop of moments caught on cell phones. Shaq lifting grocery bags for an elderly woman, walking into a hurricane shelter with blankets, visiting a sick boy's hospital room after hours. Guests moved slowly, absorbing. Some shifted awkwardly. Others lingered longer than they expected. No one spoke loudly. There was nothing performative here, just evidence and truth. By 1:01 p.m., the house was full. Eleanor arrived late. She didn't walk in with fanfare. No designer handbag, no signature lavender cardigan, just a gray wool coat, sunglasses, and silence. She paused at the edge of the lawn, watching the clusters of neighbors filtering through the grand double doors. She could have turned back, but she didn't. Inside, the smell of catered southern food filled the air. Brisket, mac and cheese, peach cobbler. A jazz trio played soft instrumentals near the back patio. But the real music came from the murmurs, the slow unraveling of assumption. Harold Tinsley, the retired dentist from 3 doors down, stood frozen in front of a framed article about Shaq paying rent for a family during COVID. "I didn't know," he whispered to his wife. Marcia Caldwell, the former PTA president who once complained about outsiders moving in, wiped at her eyes as she read a note signed simply, "You made me feel safe when I was invisible." The mansion wasn't a home that day. It was a mirror. And everyone had to look. Shaq didn't make a speech. He simply moved from room to room, quiet, present, letting the space speak for itself. He wasn't there to convince anyone. He was there to reveal what had always been true, and let them wrestle with it on their own terms. Near the fireplace, Eleanor finally stopped. Her eyes locked on a grainy video playing on the screen. Shaq kneeling beside a homeless man in Chicago, tucking socks into his bag, laughing softly with him, like they'd grown up together. She looked at the people beside her, neighbors who just days ago had nodded in agreement at her warning about neighborhood integrity. No one said a word now. She walked into the next room. There, mounted beneath the staircase, was a single photo. No fanfare, no crowd, just Lucille O'Neill, mid-laugh, seated at a church fundraiser table. A handwritten caption beneath. My mama taught me the difference between fear and hate. One can be healed, the other, you bury alone. Eleanor stood still for a long time. Outside, the sun began to shift. Long shadows stretched across manicured lawns. People filtered out, many in quiet thought, others whispering their thanks to Shaq on their way out. By late afternoon, the mansion emptied. The noise, the eyes, the tension, it all fell away, leaving behind a silence that felt clean. Shaq stood at the top of the staircase, overlooking the space once again. The banners, the faces, the memories now etched into walls that had only known wealth before. He didn't smile, but something eased in his shoulders. This house, this town, they'd seen him now. Not the man from TV, not the target of suspicion, but the neighbor, the witness, the builder. And somewhere in that awareness, something shifted, not just in Willow Creek, but in the story that was still unfolding. The morning after unity over fear, the town of Willow Creek woke to a different kind of buzz. Not from the media vans, most of those had already moved on, but from a headline that splashed across the digital front page of the Willow County Gazette. History in the Mirror, the real roots of Eleanor Whitmore's fear. Byline, Harley Rains. The article dropped like a stone in a still pond. Not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. It peeled back a curtain no one had dared to touch, and it came not from a national outlet or a scandal-hunting blog, but from someone local, someone they all knew. Harley Rains had grown up just outside Willow Creek, quiet, sharp, and relentless when it came to the truth. He'd once been a columnist writing on zoning laws and school board meetings. But the Shaq incident lit a fuse he hadn't felt since journalism school. He knew there was more beneath the surface. The way Eleanor had spoken, the way the community had rallied in coded tones, it all smelled like legacy, not just prejudice. And Harley followed the scent. His article began not with accusation, but with context, a history lesson wrapped in narrative. He traced Eleanor's lineage back to Judge Samuel Whitmore, her grandfather, a staunch segregationist in the 1950s, who publicly opposed integration in schools and authored a notorious opinion that blocked black families from buying property in 2 nearby counties. Harley didn't rely on hearsay. He attached scans of court documents, excerpts from interviews, and a black and white photo of Judge Whitmore standing beside a whites-only courthouse sign. No interpretation, just facts. Then he moved closer to the present. The article detailed how the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, of which Eleanor had been the vice president for over a decade, quietly maintained outdated zoning language well into the early 90s. A language that, while no longer legally enforceable, explicitly discouraged the sale of homes to non-traditional buyers and recommended screening to maintain neighborhood heritage. Harley didn't need to say it outright. The implications screamed louder than any accusation. Eleanor Whitmore hadn't been afraid of theft. She'd been afraid of change, of disruption to a comfort she thought was earned, but was, in fact, inherited, propped up by generations of unchallenged control. The town read in waves, first in pockets, then in murmurs, then aloud. In coffee shops and barber shops, in real estate offices, on golf carts cruising through manicured lanes. The reactions were split. Some defended her, claimed she couldn't be blamed for her family's past, that she'd done nothing illegal, that the HOA language was historic, not hateful. Others went quiet, not out of shock but recognition. They'd known parts of it, felt it, chosen not to say it out loud. And now, with the truth laid bare in ink and evidence, their silence was no longer an option. Eleanor, for her part, didn't leave her home that day. She sat at her dining table, the morning paper folded neatly, her tea untouched. Her hands trembled, not from age, but exposure. She hadn't expected the article. She knew Harley, remembered him as a boy riding bikes past her yard. She'd sent his mother holiday cards, and yet he had unearthed a truth she'd spent decades politely burying under fundraisers and floral arrangements. The calls started early. The garden club chairperson, her church friend Ruth, even Mr. Kendricks from the HOA. Some were supportive, others hesitant, but every call carried the same unspoken question. What does this mean now? By mid-afternoon, Eleanor's world no longer felt curated. It felt revealed. Across the street, Shaq had read the article too. He sat in the same study where the meeting with his team had taken place days earlier. The article lay printed beside him. He didn't gloat, he didn't celebrate, but he understood. Eleanor had not been the origin. She'd been the extension, the embodiment of a mindset woven deep into the bricks of Willow Creek. What she feared wasn't a man moving furniture, it was the erosion of an illusion that had protected her for years. That evening, Harley Rains received over 200 messages, some praise, some threats, and one voicemail he hadn't expected. It came from an unlisted number, a female voice, low, controlled. Mr. Rains, this is Eleanor Whitmore. I read your article. I don't agree with all of it, but I don't deny it, and I suppose that's a start. She hung up without leaving a number. Harley didn't try to call back. He didn't need to. Because in that one message, there was something Eleanor hadn't offered to anyone yet. Acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, even reluctant, was a crack in the stone. The kind of crack where light gets in. The air was thick with stillness, as the late afternoon sun bathed Willow Creek in a soft gold. There were no cameras left, no news vans crowding the curb. The neighborhood had grown quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This one was heavier, thoughtful, like the silence that comes after something sacred has been broken open. Eleanor sat in her parlor, her upright posture faltering for the first time in weeks. The article had reshaped her world. Not all at once, but with the slow erosion of pretense. Her phone hadn't rung since morning. The teacup beside her remained untouched, half full and cold. The headlines, the phone calls, the article, they had all passed through her like a wave through sand. But now, it was just her. And the knock, it came soft. No demand in it, no urgency. She turned her head toward the front door, already knowing who it would be. She hesitated, not out of fear, but because she wasn't sure what she could possibly say. Still, she stood, her legs unsure beneath her. She walked the length of the hallway slowly, then opened the door. Shaq stood there, alone. No press, no entourage, just a folded piece of paper in one hand, and something softer in his eyes than she'd seen before. He didn't step forward. He didn't lean in. He simply offered her the letter. I wrote this, he said, voice steady, low. Thought you should have it. She took it with slow, deliberate hands, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. There was no tension between them now, no performance, just two people who had seen too much of each other, and of themselves. She opened the letter without moving from the doorway. The handwriting was big, deliberate, each stroke pressed deep into the paper. Eleanor, I don't need an apology. I've learned not to wait on them. But I wanted to say something that maybe no one ever has. Racism doesn't just hurt the people it targets. It steals from everyone. It steals your trust, your comfort, your clarity. It wraps around your vision, until you can't see the difference between a threat and a neighbor. It turns places into prisons, people into silhouettes. It eats legacy and spits out fear. You're not the only one who's lived behind walls. I just had to learn how to walk through them instead of build more. What happened wasn't just about me, or you. It's about what we pass down, what we leave behind. So here's what I'm leaving behind today. This moment, not for shame, but for change. Shaq, she read it twice, then a third time, and then the tears came. Not the delicate kind she was used to. Those well-timed, socially appropriate drops for funerals or televised charity events. These were quiet, raw, unstoppable. For years, Eleanor had built her world out of fine china and invisible fences. She had confused stability for righteousness, silence for peace. She had clutched her lineage like a badge, never asking what it was protecting her from, or what it was protecting her within. And now, standing face to face with the man she had once called a threat, she felt something unfamiliar crack open inside her. Not guilt. That was easy. What she felt was grief, for the years she had spent looking through people, For the moments she had chosen silence instead of kindness. For the possibility that her fear had never been safety, but surrender. Shaq didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. His words had done what no confrontation could. They had pulled the curtain all the way back, left no room for denial, or for armor. She met his eyes, and for the first time, didn't see a symbol. She saw a man. I didn't know how to stop it, she whispered, her voice catching. The way I thought, the way I lived. I didn't know how deep it went. Shaq gave a small nod. Now you do, he said. With that he turned, stepping off her porch without another word. No fanfare, no lesson, just distance placed with dignity. She remained in the doorway, the letter pressed to her chest like something sacred. As he walked back across the street, the sun dipped behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the lawn, touching both their homes. Eleanor stayed there long after he disappeared inside. Tears still on her cheeks, the weight still in her chest. But for the first time in her life, crying not for what was lost, but for what might finally be found. Change in Willow Creek didn't come overnight. It came in ripples, soft, hesitant, but steady. It began quietly, almost like a rumor. A local teacher named Rebecca Holman, who taught 6th grade at Willow Creek Elementary, put away her usual lesson on colonial trade routes, and instead asked her students to write about a time they felt misunderstood. The essays surprised her. Kids talked about moments in lunch lines, on buses, even at playgrounds, moments they'd never spoken aloud before. One boy wrote about being followed in a store. Another described being told he talked too black. A girl admitted she never invited her best friend over because of how her dad might act. For the first time, the classroom felt honest. Word spread to the school board, which moved swiftly to implement anti-bias training district-wide. It wasn't perfect, and not everyone welcomed the shift. But something had cracked open, and no one could pretend it hadn't. Meanwhile, the town hall found itself packed on a Thursday evening, not with protesters or finger-pointers, but with neighbors who had once ignored agendas altogether. The topic: revision of the HOA's outdated bylaws. The language, once tucked away in dusty folders, was now front and center, exposed, challenged, and impossible to defend. Among the attendees sat Howard Kendricks, the longtime HOA president, whose voice used to carry unopposed. Now he spoke less, listened more. The motion to strike the legacy clause, the one about preserving neighborhood heritage, passed with a near unanimous vote. Only one abstention. Even Eleanor, seated in the second row, raised her hand in support. She didn't speak, but her presence said enough. Shaq didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. He had already become part of the soil, not by demanding change, but by refusing to disappear. At the corner bakery, people spoke his name differently now, no longer with awe or skepticism, but with familiarity. You see what Shaq did with the lot behind the church? They'd ask. He had donated the land quietly to convert into a public basketball court and garden space. No press, no plaque, just opportunity. The once muted community Facebook group began to shift too. The posts, once dominated by lost pets and hedge complaints, now featured things like diversity reads for kids, inclusive story time at the library, and a photo of Shaq high-fiving children at a local community cleanup. It wasn't utopia. Some still rolled their eyes at the changes, mumbled about performative nonsense, or clicked angry on posts that celebrated inclusion. But they were fewer now, and they weren't as loud. What mattered more was the new tone, not just in policy, but in posture. People asked more questions. They stopped assuming. They started seeing each other. One particularly symbolic change came from the town's historical society. A plaque that once honored Judge Samuel Whitmore, Eleanor's grandfather, for foundational community contributions, was quietly removed from the municipal building. In its place went a new display, The Evolution of Willow Creek, From Silence to Dialogue. It featured quotes from students, residents, and even Shaq himself, including one printed in bold across the top. Legacy doesn't have to be a sentence. It can be a conversation. Eleanor visited the new display one morning, long before the doors officially opened. She walked the length of the wall slowly, pausing longest at a framed photo of Lucille O'Neill. The caption beneath read, "Grace, when it costs you nothing, is charity. But grace, when it costs you comfort, that's transformation." Back on Edgeview Lane, things looked mostly the same. Manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, holiday wreaths. But inside those homes, the quiet had a different quality now. Not heavy, But away. Shaq, meanwhile, resumed his routine. Morning walks. Afternoon deliveries to the youth center under construction on the edge of town. He didn't speak at rallies or issue press statements. But when asked, he would say one thing. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm just here to be. And in that being grounded, generous, unshakable, he changed the shape of a place that once only saw him as a headline. Willow Creek didn't become perfect. But it turned a page. And this time, nobody tried to turn it back. The piece didn't break loudly. It slipped in quiet, veiled and sharp. A week had passed since the HOA vote. Willow Creek had begun to find its new rhythm. The town breathed easier. And for the first time in a long while, the space between neighbors felt less guarded. But as with all places stitched together by appearances, not every thread held tight. Shaq found the envelope on a Wednesday. It was wedged between utility bills and donation requests in his mailbox. No return address. No stamps, just his name on the front. Hand-scrawled in uppercase, the kind of writing that's meant to be anonymous but still aims to leave a mark. He opened it inside, alone in the den, under the soft amber of the reading lamp. The letter was typed, centered. A single paragraph. You think you've changed something here. You haven't. This place was never meant for you. You may own the deed, but you'll never own the soil beneath it. We don't forget who belongs. We don't forget who doesn't. There was no signature. Shaq read it once. Then again. He didn't flinch. But something behind his eyes cooled. He'd been expecting it. Not specifically, not predictably, but intuitively. Willow Creek had turned a page, but some people had only bent the corner. And when fear no longer had a microphone, it found its way back through whispers, unsigned notes, and veiled threats. He placed the letter on the counter, folded once, and didn't show it to anyone that day. Not Daryl, not his team, not even the police, not yet. He knew how stories like this got twisted once headlines got involved. Instead, he watched.
Not the news, not the cameras, the people.
That evening, he walked the perimeter of his lawn. Deliberately, slowly. Neighbors waved. Some made small talk. Others avoided eye contact. Each gesture suddenly meant more than it should. At the market, the cashier smiled, but stammered when asking about his day. A man in the parking lot nodded politely, but kept glancing toward Shaq's truck. At a red light, a police cruiser slowed as it passed. Nothing illegal, just enough to note it. The question settled in Shaq's gut like a weight. Who sent it? He began to track small patterns. The envelope had no creases. Hand-delivered. Someone local. Someone bold enough to get close, but cowardly enough to hide behind paper. His first thought wasn't Eleanor. She had seen too much now. Wept in too real a way. The letter didn't match the woman he'd watched unravel and rebuild. Still, doubt lingered. Because racism, even when unlearned, leaves roots, and roots don't vanish overnight. But other names emerged in his mind. Names that never made headlines. Faces from HOA meetings. People who sat quietly during conversations that changed the town but never said a word. And then there were those in uniform. Officer Brad Kinley hadn't been seen much since the day of the incident. Reassigned. Rumored. Shaq had noticed him once, weeks later, parked near the school zone, eyes flicking up in the mirror as Shaq drove past. No nod, no acknowledgement, just stillness. Could it have come from him? Could it have come from someone under his watch? Shaq didn't know. That was the worst part. The not knowing. The next day, Harley Raines reached out. He'd heard murmurs. A whisper about someone reminding Shaq who the town really belonged to. Harley didn't ask for a quote. He just asked, "Do you want me to look into it?" Shaq replied without hesitation. No. Because this wasn't about exposure anymore. This was about endurance. He'd received hate before. On message boards. In locker rooms. Even from corporate boardrooms. Dressed in suits and smiles. But this one felt different. Not louder, but closer. And it reminded him of a lesson. Lucille had once taught him. Sometimes the past doesn't die, baby. It just learns how to dress for dinner. The letter wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what he represented. A symbol standing in defiance of old systems, old power, old control. And the truth was, not everyone was ready to let go of those ghosts. Some wanted them fed, housed, preserved, even if it meant silencing progress. That Friday, Shaq left his porch light on all night, not as a warning, as a statement. He made no mention of the letter to the press. When asked about ongoing changes in the community, he smiled and spoke only of the youth center's progress and the school partnerships underway. But behind that public calm, the storm still loomed, not outside his door, but inside the conscience of the town. Because the letter didn't just shake Shaq, it cast a long shadow over Willow Creek. Everyone began wondering, was it someone I know? Someone I trust? Eleanor heard about it 2 days later, through a neighbor who phrased it delicately. I heard Shaquille got something awful in the mail. Some kind of threat. Her face drained of color. She didn't speak. She just nodded, walked back inside, and sat with the knowledge that even if she hadn't written it, she may have helped plant the soil it grew in. In the days that followed, the town felt it. A shift, not backward, but unsettled.
The wound had never closed fully.
Shaq kept walking his path, head held high. But the question lingered now in every gaze. The past hadn't died. It had just stepped aside, waiting for a quieter moment to return. And now, it had. Spring returned to Willow Creek, in quiet bloom. Dogwoods lined the sidewalks. Children's laughter began to filter into the streets again. But the air still held something else beneath the warmth, something unspoken. Shaq could have left. No one would have blamed him. He had endured the stares, the lies, the threat that slid into his mailbox like a whisper of old hatred. He had peeled back the history of a town that claimed to be innocent, and found rot woven through its foundations. But Shaq didn't leave. He doubled down. The idea came without ceremony. One evening, standing alone in the center of the town square, he looked at the empty stone pedestal where a Confederate statue once stood. It had been quietly removed 2 years prior after local protest, hauled away in the night, debated in newsletters, never replaced. Since then, the space had sat hollow, untouched, forgotten, until Shaq saw what it could become. He didn't hold a press conference, didn't campaign. He funded the project quietly, but with purpose. The paperwork moved fast. His lawyers handled the details. The architect was a local graduate, barely 30, who had grown up playing ball on cracked asphalt just 2 towns over. The new structure rose in silence over the months that followed. A low, modern building made of reclaimed brick and glass, with open spaces inside for art, learning, mentorship, and movement. The name was chiseled onto the front in soft gray stone. The Lucille O'Neill Center for Youth and Community. It sat like a promise, bold, steady, grounded. Word of the project spread fast. At first, whispers, then speculation, then admiration. But Shaq said little. He showed up in work boots twice during construction, helped lift boxes, brought food to the volunteers. He didn't do it for the cameras. There weren't any. Opening day came beneath a sky, as clear as intention. A modest crowd gathered on the lawn. Families, students, teachers, pastors, even former skeptics. The mayor gave a short speech, praising those who build bridges where walls once stood. Harley Raines read a letter aloud from a teen who'd already applied to be a mentor there. Eleanor was present, standing in the second row, hands folded around a small bouquet of lilies she left quietly on the steps when no one was watching. But Shaq didn't take the mic. He stood off to the side in a slate gray suit, sunglasses hiding what his eyes might have said. When asked why he wouldn't speak, he only smiled and replied, "This ain't about me. This is about her." He meant Lucille. Inside the youth center, the first exhibit was a mural, not of Shaq, but of Lucille, arms open wide, painted in vibrant strokes, surrounded by children of every shade, laughing, learning, creating. Below it, in brass letters, "We don't just raise children, we raise each other." The building buzzed with possibility. Classrooms filled with supplies, studios wired for music, a small library, a basketball court out back. Not flashy, just smooth concrete and sturdy rims. As the ribbon was cut and cheers rose, Shaq remained still, taking it all in. And across the street, at the edge of a shadowed alley between 2 brick storefronts, a man stood alone. He wore a ball cap pulled low, sunglasses, hands in pockets. He wasn't part of the celebration. He didn't clap. He didn't approach, but he watched. He was older, mid-50s, weathered, the kind of face that blends in, that lives in the corners of towns like Willow Creek, never loud, never seen, until he wants to be. Shaq noticed him almost immediately. There was something familiar in his stance, the tension, the distance, a kind of posture that wasn't curiosity. It was observation, and something colder beneath it. Shaq didn't need confirmation. He knew. The man said nothing, did nothing, just watched as children rushed through the front doors, as neighbors embraced, as the statue's old footprint bloomed into life again. Then, without warning, the man turned and walked away. No confrontation, no words. He disappeared down the alley and never looked back. Shaq didn't follow, because he understood something that day. Something deeper than justice. The man's presence was a confession. His silence, a surrender. He didn't come to sabotage. He came to see. And sometimes, that's the beginning of reckoning. Not a moment of punishment, but a moment of knowing you've already lost. Shaq remained on the steps of the center until the crowd began to thin. He greeted the last few children with fist bumps, posed for a couple of photos, then stepped inside. The building was cool, filled with laughter echoing through its new walls. He walked to the mural of Lucille and stood before it. In that quiet, he whispered, "We did it, Matt."
The world hadn't healed.
The town hadn't transformed overnight, but he had left something here that couldn't be erased. Not in ink,
Not in memory.
not even in fear, because presence, real, rooted, persistent presence, speaks louder than any threat. And Big Shaq had always known how to show up. Think this was just a story? It's a reflection. Look around. The real Willow Creeks are everywhere. Let this be more than a moment. Start the conversation. Challenge the silence. Because change doesn't wait. It walks in, just like Shaq did.